In October of 1979, Democratic President Jimmy Carter was in a fight for his political life. Inflation was up, gas prices went up, and supply was short, unemployment was high, and the president's approval rating was at 30%. With this, one Democrat was chomping at the bit to take a crack at the presidency. That Democrat was Ted Kennedy, the last of the famed Kennedy family brothers. Kennedy would challenge Carter for the nomination in one of the most bitter battles for the Democratic nomination in recent history. But even after the president was renominated as the Democratic candidate, the battle wasn't over. Bitterness over the primary would continue, with advisors leaving the Democratic Party, joining other campaigns, and even stealing information from the Carter campaign and handing it over to the campaign of the Republican nominee, Ronald Reagan. This is the story of the 1980 Democratic primary between President Jimmy Carter and Senator Ted Kennedy. Welcome to Election History. My name is Dave, and I make videos about campaigns, elections, political parties, candidates, and other election-related things. I worked in politics for 30-plus years and have a master's degree in political science and am a published academic author in the same field. If you like election-related content, please subscribe to the channel and like the video. The Patreon producer for today's video is Dakota. It's people like Dakota that make this channel possible. If you would like to join my Patreon and support the channel, as well as access to bonus videos, please become a member of the channel here on YouTube or join my Patreon, where there are even more perks that aren't on YouTube. Again, thank you for all your support. Now, on to the video. Before we get into the 1980 Democratic primary, let's look at the shape of things in the middle of 1979. First, we have a gas crisis, which resulted in nearly 50% of gas stations not having gas, and of those that did have gas, they charged 50% more than the previous year. But it wasn't just gas at the pumps. Gas used for heating in homes also increased drastically. Inflation had also increased prices on everything, with a nationwide inflation rate of around 13%. Unemployment was at 6%, but that wasn't necessarily higher than previously, but still high nonetheless. On the foreign policy front, things were a little better. Carter was in the middle of negotiations with the Soviet Union on a nuclear arms treaty. He was trying to normalize relations with China, which Carter saw as minimizing the influence of the Soviet Union, and was able to negotiate a treaty between Israel and Egypt. With the exception of foreign policy, Carter was in a bad spot. Many within the Democratic Party argued that Carter was spending too much time on foreign policy and not enough time focusing on inflation, employment, and other domestic issues. However, even when he did make the shift over to talking about more domestic issues, he got blowback as to which issues he should be prioritizing. When the Carter campaign decided to make inflation the focal point of their messaging, Louis Martin, the president's special liaison to the African American community, said that black leaders were mad at him because he was talking more about inflation than unemployment. He talked about cutting spending in his 1979 State of the Union address, which angered Democrats that were for increasing social safety net spending. It also didn't help that Carter said that the administration would cut the deficit by 33%, though it had actually increased. But Carter also was hurt by bad timing. For example, when he advocated a move toward independent energy, which he recommended nuclear power, which was no surprise because he was a nuclear engineer while serving in the Navy, the nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania happened, with public opinion within his party turning against him. Still, even though Carter's foreign policy was mostly looked at in a positive light by many in the general public, there were also times of trouble. When U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Andrew Young, met with the Palestinian Liberation Organization leaders after Carter had specifically stated that the administration would not negotiate with the PLO, notes of the meeting were leaked by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency. Even with all of these problems, the fiscal condition of the country was still front and center. But Carter's pollster, Pat Caddell, was more convinced that the problem wasn't about the issues, but that Americans had been suffering over the last decade, as well as American culture being overwhelmed by consumerism and indulgence. He looked at Carter's low approval ratings as a result of lower morale, and that a self-reflecting speech focused on the direction of American morality would be better than addressing the issues facing the nation. Many people in his inner circle thought that the speech would be a mistake, since it wasn't addressing the real problems that people were dealing with. But Carter did give the speech, now known as the Malay speech, though he never used that word. There would be mixed reviews to the speech, with some saying that it told the truth about the problems in America, while others said that it sounded like he was blaming Americans for the economic condition of the country. But overall, it came across as sincere, with many seeing the Jimmy Carter that they had known back in 1976. But another thing that needs to be mentioned here was that a lot of his conservative support in the South was eroding quickly. Since the mid-1960s, the Conservatives and Republican Party found the South as the best place to grow their support. While socially conservative, they were also hawks when it came to foreign policy issues, deeming any threats against America's hegemonic position in the world as a threat to national security. And with Carter working towards normalizing relations with China, returning the Panama Canal to Panama, and Carter criticizing Israel for using cluster bombs against the Palestinian Liberation Organization, many conservatives in the South started to consolidate around one of his possible Republican challengers, Ronald Reagan. However, the entire national mood of the country would change. The collapse of the Iranian regime in 1979 led to the leader of that country, known as the Shah, to flee his country. As a result, an Islamist fundamentalist government took over, with the Ayatollah Khomeini taking control. In November, responding to the Shah being allowed to seek treatment for cancer in the United States, supporters of the Ayatollah stormed the American embassy in Tehran, taking the American employees and diplomats hostage. As a result, Carter initially benefited from a rally around the flag effect, which saw his approval rating jump from 35% a few months earlier to 61%. Now, there are a lot of other events that happened at the time that I cannot fit into this video, but suffice to say that these are the main points you need to know about the political atmosphere at the time Kennedy decided to enter the race for president. Ted Kennedy had been thinking about running for a while. His name had been considered in the last 3 presidential elections ever since the assassination of his brother Robert F. Kennedy, when his name was being floated around as a possible candidate in 1968. But this time it was different. Kennedy had been planning on running for nearly a year. There were 2 main reasons why Kennedy was considering entering the race. First, he felt that many of the liberal ideas that he supported were being ignored by Carter, especially when it came to the issue of universal health care. Secondly, he felt that Carter was a weak leader and was ineffective when it came to the presidency. Kennedy saw Carter as being indecisive and not making any bold moves. He also saw Carter as someone who didn't know how to operate in the world of politics, something that Kennedy relished. After watching the Malay speech, Kennedy decided to run, as he felt that Carter didn't understand the problems facing the nation, seeing Carter as a terrible leader who had squandered the opportunity that he had been given. Kennedy had been meeting with his staff about running and decided that he was going to run around Labor Day. Kennedy informed Carter himself on September 7th, 1979, that he was going to be running for president. However, he still didn't make a decision on when to announce his candidacy. Around Labor Day, Carter's approval ratings were in the tank at only 19%, according to an Associated Press NBC poll. Had he made the decision to run at that point, he would have probably been considered the frontrunner. But before Kennedy actually entered his name into the race, there had already been a Dump Carter, Draft Kennedy movement. One of the first places for this movement to take hold was in the state of Florida, where 2 people who had worked for Carter back in 1976, Sergio Ben Dixon and Mike Abrams, decided to launch an organization to help Kennedy. The main reason that both men started the organization was because they were tired of dealing with Hamilton Jordan as well as other Carter aides, as well as being strongly pro-Kennedy. In September, Steve Smith, Ted Kennedy's brother-in-law, as well as top advisor for John F. Kennedy's campaign in 1960, as well as the campaign manager for RFK's campaign in 1968, asked Ben Dixon to join him in New York City. When Ben Dixon arrived in New York to meet with Smith, Smith said that they couldn't meet in his office, but in a parking lot outside instead. The main topic of discussion was how the Kennedys could help finance the Florida operation. Since Kennedy had not yet filed the paperwork to run for president, it was illegal for his campaign to be involved with funding any movement on his behalf. According to Ben Dixon, quote, "He kept looking over his shoulder. He wanted to make sure that nobody saw us," end of quote. When Ben Dixon arrived back in Florida, money started to flow in, as well as a few of Ted Kennedy's operatives. The reason why Florida was to be so important was because there was to be a Florida Democratic Party straw poll conducted on October 13th, 1979. If Kennedy lost by a huge amount, then many would question the viability of his run, especially against an incumbent president. If he lost by a smaller margin, it would show that even though Kennedy had lost, there were a number of people within Carter's own party, as well as in the South, who did not want Carter to continue as president. At the straw poll, which actually allowed all registered Democrats to vote, Carter won about 58% of the delegates. This was probably the worst result for both sides. Carter wouldn't say that he had whooped Kennedy's ass, a line that had been going around for months after it had been reported that Carter uttered these words while talking to several Democratic congressmen. As for Kennedy, it wasn't close enough to show that he was in striking distance of Carter. Still, in a St. Petersburg Times Orlando Sentinel poll that was released the same day of the straw poll, showed that both Kennedy and Carter were tied in the state at 43%. When asked who would make a better president, 44% said Kennedy compared to 36% for Carter. Carter also had a 66% negative rating. So even though the straw poll didn't go either person's way, remember, Kennedy wasn't an officially announced candidate yet. These poll numbers did look much better for Kennedy. Then, interestingly, both Carter and Kennedy met at the dedication of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston on October 20th. Yes, this was a dedication to the library, but was also an opportunity for each to one-up the other with some witty quotes. When Carter came to the podium, he said the following:
"I never met him, but I know that John Kennedy loved politics. He loved laughter, and when the two came together, he loved that best of all. For example, in a press conference in March 1962, when the ravages of being president were beginning to show on his face, he was asked this two-part question. Mr. President, your brother Ted said recently on television that after seeing the cares of office on you, he wasn't sure he would ever be interested in being president." And the questioner continued, "I wonder if you could tell us whether, first, if you had it to do over again, you would work for the presidency, and second, whether you can recommend this job to others." The president replied, "Well, the answer to the first question is yes, and the second is no. I do not recommend it to others, at least for a while." As you can well see, President Kennedy's wit and also his wisdom is certainly as relevant today as it was then.
Not only did that come off as an attack with a smile, it didn't help that those in the crowd were actually laughing. When Kennedy got up, it was different. Sure, he gave a good speech, but his speaking abilities weren't nearly like those of his brothers. Some had started to wonder if Ted Kennedy was really the same as John or Robert. And with his personal problems, such as his separation from his wife, as well as the incident at Chappaquiddick, people wondered if he could really win. Now, for the 5 of you out there who are watching a video about Ted Kennedy and don't know about Chappaquiddick, let me summarize it quickly. In July of 1969, Kennedy drove his car off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts, with 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne as a passenger. Kennedy escaped the submerged vehicle, but Kopechne was trapped inside and drowned. He did not report the incident to the authorities until the following morning, more than 9 hours later. There are more than enough videos on YouTube that will allow you to go down that rabbit hole, but I'll just keep it there for now. Still, Chappaquiddick had always been the albatross that was hanging around Ted Kennedy's neck if and when he decided to run for president. Everyone knew that it would be an issue, and how he dealt with that issue on the campaign trail might determine if his campaign sank or swam. No pun intended. To air this out, Kennedy agreed to 2 interviews with CBS's Roger Mudd, who was a friend to the Kennedy family. Kennedy had agreed over the summer to sit down for a pair of interviews with Mudd for an hour-long special focused on his life and political career. The interviews had been filmed on September 29th at Cape Cod and on October 12th in Washington, D.C., and then they were edited into the special. The interview with Mudd was absolutely disastrous. First of all, most of the interview was about the events at Chappaquiddick. Surprisingly to Mudd, there was nobody in the room to advise Kennedy or to stop the questioning if things got out of hand. With that, Mudd was able to continue talking about Chappaquiddick, with Kennedy giving less than convincing answers, coming across as if he was trying to look for excuses. Because I can't find the whole interview online, which kind of surprises me, let me give you a quote from that interview that is in John Ward's book, Camelot's End. In a response to Mudd asking about the state of Kennedy's marriage, Kennedy responded, and I'm going to try to do this, quote, I think that you've had some difficult times, but I think I have Jesus. I think we've been able to make some very good progress, and it's I would say that it's delight that we were able to share the time and the relationship that we do share. End of quote. Jesus Christ. This was all in the first interview that was held. By the time the second interview came along, Mudd was still questioning Kennedy about Chappaquiddick, but Kennedy was less forthcoming this time, saying a lot less than he did before. Being frustrated that the second interview wasn't going anywhere, Mudd decided to throw Kennedy a softball question to get the interview back on track.
Why do you want to be president?
Well, were I to make the announcement and to run, the reasons that I would run is because I have a great belief in this country that there's more natural resources than any nation of the world, as the greatest educated population in the world, the greatest technology of any country in the world, the greatest capacity for innovation in the world, and the greatest political system in the world. And yet I see at the current time that most of the industrial nations of the world are exceeding us in terms of productivity, are doing better than us in terms of meeting the problems of inflation, that they're dealing with their problems of energy and their problems of unemployment. And it just seems to me that this nation can cope and deal with its problems in a way that it has in the past. We're facing complex issues and problems in this nation at this time, but we have faced similar challenges at other times. And the energies and the resourcefulness of this nation, I think, should be focused on these problems in a way that brings a sense of restoration in this country by its people in dealing with the problems that we face, primarily the issues on the economy, the problems of inflation, and the problems of energy. And I would basically feel that that it's imperative for this country to either move forward, that it can't stand still, or otherwise it moves backward.
What would you do different from Carter?
Well, in which particular areas?
Well, just take the question of leadership.
Well, it's you know, you have to come to grips with the different issues.
The question apparently flummoxed Kennedy, as he clearly wasn't prepared to answer this question. Roger Mudd would later say that he was saying to himself, quote, He doesn't know why he's running. It's like, I want to be president because the sea is so deep and the sky is blue. End of quote. There was already more than enough in the interview that would be damaging to Kennedy, but his inability to answer this question would be what would last in history. The interview would air on CBS on November 4th, just 3 days before Kennedy's announcement. Fortunately for Kennedy, the airing of the interview was at the same time as ABC's network airing of Jaws. Remember, video recorders were still somewhat in their infancy, and recording another channel was impossible without a second television. So many Americans actually didn't see the interview and learned more about it from press accounts the next day. Bob Dole, senator from Kansas and a Republican candidate for president, said, quote, 75% of the country watched Jaws, 25% watched Roger Mudd, and half of them couldn't tell the difference. End of quote. And with all of this happening before his announcement, Kennedy still announced that he was running for president on November 7th, 1979 at Faneuil Hall in Boston, unlike his brothers who announced from the Senate caucus room in Washington, D.C. It should be said that California Governor Jerry Brown had also been running for president, which would be his second go after entering late in 1976 to challenge Carter, which I talk about in my video about the 1976 primary. But Brown didn't perform well, only gained one delegate and dropped out by April 2nd, 1980. However, I wanted to mention him here because he will be mentioned in the vote totals throughout the video. One thing to know about Kennedy is that he never had to do retail politicking before. When he worked for his brothers, it was always in a higher role in the campaign. When he ran for U.S. Senate in the past, it was within the safe boundaries of Massachusetts. Now, Kennedy had to go outside of his comfort zone, giving speeches in the U.S. Senate, and talking to rural voters in Iowa. And because of this, the media wasn't kind to Kennedy. Every little mistake he made, such as saying fam farmly when giving a speech, would be magnified. He also didn't help himself when he said the Shah of Iran had, quote, one of the most violent regimes in the history of mankind, end of quote. While Kennedy might have been right, it did make it seem like he was sympathetic to those holding the hostages in the embassy in Tehran. The day before Carter officially announced that he was running for re-election, which was December 3rd, a poll was released showing Carter with 42% to Kennedy's 40% and Jerry Brown with 11%. Yes, this is when people who don't understand the concept of polling start saying polls are fake in the comments section. All I want to say is thanks for the engagement and helping me in the algorithm. Anyway, in the poll, 69% of Americans approved of Carter's handling of the crisis, while 56% of Americans said that Kennedy shouldn't have spoken out against the Shah when he came to the United States. As with Carter 4 years earlier, Kennedy knew that he had to win Iowa in order to be competitive. The Kennedy's campaign strategy was to win Iowa and to scare Carter out of the race, like Eugene McCarthy might have done in 1968, and to be the frontrunner. As campaign advisor Joe Trippi said, quote, the only strategy was to win Iowa, end of quote. Before Kennedy made his announcement, a poll from the Des Moines Register in August showed Kennedy winning 49% of Iowans to 26% for Jimmy Carter. However, Kennedy didn't have a great campaign in Iowa. Questions about Chappaquiddick, his separation from his wife, and his response to the Shah brought his campaign down. Ted Kennedy's wife, Joan, was actually brought onto the campaign when questions about their separation became more public. It didn't help that she said that the separation was good because Ted was able to see his son Patrick more. Carter also leaned in attacking Kennedy, saying in a TV ad, quote, I don't think there's any way you can separate the responsibilities of being a husband or a father or a basic human being from that of being a good president. End of quote. The 23-point lead that Kennedy had in Iowa in August had disappeared in December. A new poll was conducted showing both candidates at 40%, with 9% for California Governor Jerry Brown. And when it came to overall job approval rating, Carter surged as well, mostly because of his early handling of the Iranian hostage crisis. 56% of Iowans approved of Carter's handling of the situation, as well as 45% of Republicans. Yes, cue up the polls must be fake comment down in the section below. But Kennedy's campaign needed to change, which wasn't going to be easy. He had been attacking Carter's ability to lead the country, but Carter was benefiting from a rally behind the flag effect due to the Iran hostage crisis. Therefore, going after Carter's leadership was a bad strategy. So, the campaign switched over to talking more about inflation and energy, which weren't passionate issues for Kennedy. Instead, he wanted to talk about universal health care and other liberal policies. But his campaign advised him against this, as it would surely hurt him outside the most liberal states as well as in the general election. So, a new course for the campaign was set. Carter was going to continue talking about foreign policy, and Kennedy was going to talk about inflation and energy. As John Ward said in his book Camelot's End, Kennedy, the passionate liberal, was replaced by an uncertain, fumbling Northeasterner who talked in Iowa of controlling inflation, projecting greater American strength abroad, and even balancing the federal budget without any details. As it was getting closer to caucus day, things weren't improving for Kennedy. His campaign thought that they could get Iowa farmers to support them because of Carter's grain embargo on the Soviet Union. But farmers, though upset with the policy, didn't trust Kennedy based on all of what was mentioned earlier, and had more trust in Carter when it came to agricultural issues, since Carter was a farmer himself. Also, the whole issue of how Kennedy responded to the Iran crisis made people question his patriotism. It was bad all around. A week before the caucus, Carter was now leading Kennedy 57% to 27% in a Des Moines Register poll, a flip-flop from the poll done 5 months earlier. As for Carter's campaign, much of it worked as it had in 1976. Many of the organizers and volunteers that had worked in his first run for president came in and worked on his second run, and since they were now seasoned when it came to turning out caucus voters, they had a leg up on Kennedy. Kennedy would go on to lose to Carter, with Carter winning 59% of Iowa caucus delegates and Kennedy with 31%, with the Des Moines Register poll a week earlier being spot on. But as Joe Trippi said earlier, their strategy was based on winning Iowa. With that, the Kennedys didn't have much of an organization in the upcoming states, the main caucuses and the New Hampshire primary. As a result, all of his people from Iowa were brought into these states and tried to organize within a few days. On top of that, Kennedy spent a lot of money in Iowa, now with only $200,000 of his $4 million that he had raised still in the bank. After Iowa, many that were connected to the family name, like Steve Smith, wanted Kennedy to drop out to avoid tarnishing the family name, but Bob Shrum said that he should carry on, saying that he would be labeled a quitter if he dropped out. After Carter gave his State of the Union address to Congress, in which he said he was going to increase military spending and tackle the Soviet Union after the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan, Kennedy decided to stay in the race, seeing Carter as a warmonger. Kennedy also changed his campaign tactics. Knowing that his back was against the wall, he decided to go on the attack against Carter, as well as not back down from what he said in the past. In a speech held at Georgetown University on January 29th, Kennedy would go back to attacking the Shah's regime, as well as saying that it was Carter's fault that the hostages were being held because he allowed the Shah to receive treatment in the U.S. He also started talking about his liberal ideas and saying that Carter was essentially a Republican when it came to economics and his handling of the economy. However, the media still wanted to talk about Chappaquiddick. Even though some people in his campaign wanted him to talk about it, Kennedy responded by saying that he had already given testimony regarding the incident and that those records were public. If they wanted to know anything more about the case, they could search those records. Kennedy was done talking about Chappaquiddick. Still, Kennedy continued to have organizational problems. There were a number of advisors in the Kennedy campaign that came from both John and Robert Kennedy's campaign, but the 1960 campaign environment was different from that of 1968, with both being different than 1980. Therefore, there was always indecision within the Kennedy campaign as to what to do. As advisor Harold Ickes would say, the campaign would vote to do something and then the next day would vote against what they had just voted for. He called it a fucking nightmare. The main caucuses were held on February 10th, with Carter winning. Even though he was expected to dominate the caucus, even with Kennedy being from the region, Carter didn't perform as well as many thought. He was leading in a poll 1 week before the caucuses by 19%, but only won by 6%. So yes, the margin was getting tighter. Even though Kennedy was easily defeated in the first 2 caucuses, he decided to stay the course and continuing attacking Carter. And even though Carter was still benefiting from the rally around the flag effect, Kennedy still decided to attack Carter on the Iranian hostage crisis, saying, quote, "We will rally around the flag, but we must not rally around the failures of the president that threatens the real interest of the nation. I will reject the course of false patriotism." End of quote. Carter would go on to win the New Hampshire primary with 47% of the vote, compared to 37% for Kennedy. Again, this was another battle in Kennedy's own backyard, and a state that Carter only won by a little under 5% against Mo Udall back in 1976. Again, shameless plug, check out that video. Still, to show you how much of an upset this was, a poll by the Boston Globe done back in September of 1979 showed Kennedy with 68% of the vote compared to Carter's 20%. This went along with the national tide, which showed that Kennedy had blown tremendous leads over the course of a few months. As for Jerry Brown, he received 10% of the vote and was blamed by the Kennedy campaign for being the spoiler that led to Carter's victory. Still, according to a Boston Globe poll, Carter won 52% of Catholic voters compared to only 34% for Kennedy. The Kennedys had always played up their Irish Catholic heritage, but it didn't work in the New Hampshire primary. In fact, the Boston Globe polls from September that I mentioned earlier showed Kennedy winning 74% of the Catholic voters back in that September poll. Easily, the Kennedy campaign was falling like a rock. The next month was to be brutal for the Kennedy campaign. Of the next 15 primaries and caucuses, Kennedy only won his home state of Massachusetts, but Carter was still able to grab 34 out of the 111 delegates from the Commonwealth. As for Carter, he won neighboring Vermont with 73% of the vote, again dominating Kennedy in his own backyard. Also, Carter would win the primaries and conventions in Alabama, Alaska, Florida, Georgia, and Oklahoma, picking up 181 of the primary delegates compared to 26 for Kennedy. 4 days later, Carter again would dominate the Mississippi and South Carolina caucuses. The next primary that could be competitive was Illinois. In 1976, Carter dominated the Illinois primary, but the delegates were selected separately. Most of the delegates elected were unpledged and planned on favoring Adlai Stevenson III as a favorite son candidate. However, with Chicago Mayor Richard Daley supporting Carter once he had basically secured the nomination, the delegates went to Carter. But 1980 was going to be different. First, Daley was dead. Second, the new mayor, Jane Byrne, endorsed Kennedy, even though she had held a fundraiser for Carter just a few days before endorsing Kennedy. Third, all of the delegates on the ballot this time were pledged to either Carter or Kennedy, as there was no unpledged or favorite son alternatives. However, the Jane Byrne endorsement wouldn't really help and was a liability. First of all, after her election, she became very unpopular amongst black voters. As for white voters, many of them were still more loyal to Daley than to Byrne and only voted for Byrne in the 1979 mayor's race to defeat Michael Bilandic. Again, another shameless plug for my video about the 1983 Chicago mayor's race, which goes into the dynamics of this in great detail. The late mayor's son, Richard M. Daley, endorsed Carter. With black voters and white voters backing Carter, there was no way that Kennedy could win. Carter destroyed Kennedy in Illinois, winning 65% of the vote and 165 of Illinois' 179 delegates. Now, it should be said that Kennedy was hitting the campaign trail in all of these states, still attacking Carter, especially on Iran. As for Carter, he stayed in Washington to deal with the hostage crisis. Not only did Carter think that this was where his energies needed to be focused, but that it would also play into the leadership message that the campaign was pushing. The first worry for the Carter campaign was the states of Connecticut and New York. The rally around the flag effect was starting to wear off. According to Pat Caddell, Carter's pollster, people in these upcoming primaries were mostly worried about inflation, the hostages, and a vote in the United Nations where the United States voted to denounce the Israeli settlements in Gaza and the West Bank, which angered Jewish voters in both of these states. Caddell had also noted that Carter's lead in the internal polls that they had in New York went from 20% lead a week earlier to 9% just before the primary. As for the Kennedys, they couldn't afford polling, and many in the organization thought that they were going to lose. Steve Smith again stepped up his efforts to get Ted to quit so that he wouldn't bring down the family name. Smith even had Bob Shrum write up a speech to announce that Ted would be dropping out of the race. The head of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, Wendell Ford, said that Kennedy should drop out because his constant attacks against the president could hurt Democrats in senatorial races. But Kennedy was able to put that speech away as he won both states. Kennedy won Connecticut by 5%, but won New York by a whopping 17.8%. Caddell said that not only were the attacks on Kennedy's character wearing off, but Carter was being seen as weak on the Iran hostage situation, with the crisis entering its 7th month. But still, the next 3 weeks would go Carter's way, winning primaries in Kansas, Wisconsin, and Louisiana, as well as delegate conventions in South Carolina, Virginia, Idaho, Washington, Iowa, Minnesota, Mississippi, Oklahoma, and the Missouri caucuses. Kennedy would win the Arizona caucus by just under 10%. The next big battleground was Pennsylvania. After New York, Kennedy spent all of his time in Pennsylvania, not even bothering with the other states that I just mentioned. He was now in the 1976 Scoop Jackson approach to winning the nomination, which mostly focused on the remaining big states, which were Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Texas, California, and New Jersey. If Kennedy were to win the nomination, he would have to win all these states by large margins. Small wins would give him the W, but wouldn't help him build a lead when it came to delegates. As far as the states mentioned, Kennedy already knew he would lose Texas, which would give Carter a huge chunk of delegates. But back to Pennsylvania. Over the last few weeks, there were more questions about Carter's ability as president. The day before the Wisconsin primary, Carter said that a deal had been reached regarding the hostages and they would be released soon. Well, that wasn't the case, and Carter was raked over the coals for that. Still, Kennedy continued on the attack. He would go on to win the April 22nd Pennsylvania primary by only 0.28% and only win 3 more delegates than Carter out of the 185 Pennsylvania had to offer. 4 days later, Kennedy would win the Michigan caucuses, but only by 1.6%. Yes, Kennedy was getting the victories, but not enough delegates to make this a fight. And while 2 days later, on April 28th, when a failed rescue attempt in Iran resulted in the loss of 8 servicemen, Carter would still do well in the May primaries, caucuses, and conventions, with Kennedy only winning the Washington, D.C. primary. Interestingly, while the rescue mission was a failure, it actually helped Carter because it showed that he was actually trying to do something to rescue the hostages. The last day of the primaries was on June 3rd, which was then Super Tuesday, with California, New Jersey, Ohio, West Virginia, South Dakota, Rhode Island, and New Mexico all holding primaries. By this time, Jerry Brown had dropped out of the race, though his name was still on the California primary ballot. At this point, Carter was only 11 delegates short of the nomination. Carter finally made campaign appearances in Columbus and Cleveland, Ohio on May 29th. This would be the only time that Jimmy Carter officially held campaign events during the entire primary season. And while the nomination was almost certainly Carter's, Kennedy continued to attack the president as he had been doing. He also thought that the nomination could be fought on the convention floor, but this was nearly impossible if Kennedy were to win the required number of pledged delegates before the convention. And on June 3rd, he did just that. Kennedy won both California and New Jersey, but Carter won Ohio, now having over 1,900 delegates with 1,666 needed for the nomination. Kennedy was mathematically out of the race, though his mind was still in the race. 2 days after the primary, Kennedy and Carter met at the White House. Carter had hoped that Kennedy would drop out, but he didn't. Kennedy instead asked for a debate between the two, but Carter refused, and rightfully so. He now had the delegates. Kennedy said that he was planning on taking this fight all the way to the convention. Now, Kennedy's continuation of this fight seems to be born out of both anger and delusion. The delusion was obviously that Carter had enough delegates needed to win the nomination. But the anger seemed to be from both Kennedy and his staff, with many speculating since then that a large number of Kennedy's staffers wanted Ronald Reagan, now the Republican nominee, to beat Carter. The only way that Kennedy was going to win the nomination was by having an open convention. Interestingly, after the 1968 Democratic Convention debacle, which led to the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which delegates were selected by voters of the state, a reform that Kennedy supported, he now wanted to go back to the old ways with an open convention where party bosses could decide who the nominee was. Essentially, if the convention was open, then the primary results meant nothing. But as luck would have it, there would be another incident that Jimmy Carter would have to deal with, this time with his brother Billy. Billy Carter, who didn't have a squeaky clean image, had a civil complaint filed against him by the Justice Department for not registering as a foreign agent for helping the Libyan government get access to the administration. On the same day, which was July 14th, Billy registered as a foreign agent and was now officially on record helping a country which saw the burning down of the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli in December of 1979. This was music to Kennedy's ears, with the focus being back on the economy and the rally behind the flag effect gone for Carter. Kennedy thought that winning an open convention was a strong possibility. But it wasn't just Kennedy that was looking at the possibility of the nomination. Members of Congress and Democratic Party officials that were disgusted with both Carter and Kennedy were looking for alternatives, with Walter Mondale, Scoop Jackson, and Ed Muskie being considered as possible contenders if the convention were to be opened. In fact, West Virginia Senator Robert Byrd was trying to get a number of other Democratic senators to publicly support the idea of Carter dropping out, but he failed. A few days later, Byrd would publicly back an open convention. While Carter wasn't dead, it did look like the vultures were circling in the air, as a new Harris ABC poll showed that Carter had a 77% disapproval rating. By this time, 6 Democratic governors and 113 members of Congress supported an open convention, according to John Ward's book. On August 11th, the first night of the Democratic Convention, there were worries that many Carter delegates might vote to have an open convention. There was to be a vote to suspend the rules of the convention and have an open convention, which would mean that delegates didn't have to vote for who they were pledged to on the first ballot. There was also talk that Carter's delegations from Illinois, Pennsylvania, and California could defect over to the Kennedy side. However, there was also talk that the main delegation was going to split from Carter and start a draft Muskie effort. When Carter got wind of this, he phoned Muskie and asked him to talk to his delegation, which he did. The draft Muskie effort was over before it even started. Still, when Muskie's name was mentioned, many of those who had supported Kennedy purely as an anti-Carter move were considering Muskie. This made the Kennedy camp realize that a lot of their delegates were simply anti-Carter, not pro-Kennedy. Still, when all was said and done, the Carter side held firm, and only 1,390 voted for an open convention to the 1,936 that supported Carter's position. And at 9:46 p.m., Kennedy called Carter to tell him that he was dropping out. But the fight and rifts weren't over. If Kennedy couldn't win the nomination, he would try to change the platform. While many of Carter's delegates liked the man, they were more liberal on policy. Therefore, when it came to creating the party's platform, many of Carter's ideas were taken out and replaced with Kennedy's. Before the vote on the platform was to be taken on the floor of the convention, Kennedy gave a robust speech and is considered one of his best ever speeches, where he invoked his family, his liberal ideas, and came across as being humble as a candidate, but also a fighter. This helped soften up the delegates to support the platform that Kennedy wanted. Carter decided not to fight on the platform and let it pass as amended. Still, Carter knew that he needed Kennedy's support to win the general election. He wanted to show that Kennedy was on board. On the last day of the convention, when Carter made his acceptance speech, the idea was that Kennedy would stay in his hotel room until after Carter made his speech, with the two of them then on stage. Kennedy was told to stay in his hotel because the Carter campaign thought that if Kennedy was in the hall at the same time, that all of the cameras would be continually showing Kennedy during Carter's speech. Once Carter finished, Kennedy took his time getting over to Madison Square Garden. When he arrived, he took his time getting over to Carter. He was stalling on purpose. When the two men were finally together, Carter expected the two men to raise their hand in unity. Instead, Kennedy did a simple handshake, 3 in fact, with no enthusiasm whatsoever. This was not the moment that Carter wanted. Now, this is where I would usually say, and that's the end of the video, but not quite yet. Many in Kennedy's campaign were bitter, even though the Carter campaign extended their hand to Kennedy's campaign workers to join them. Most refused and went back to work in Kennedy's Senate office. As for Patrick Lucy, a Kennedy campaign advisor and former governor of Wisconsin, he would be the running mate for independent candidate John Anderson, who would actually take more votes away from Carter than Reagan. While Anderson might have prevented Carter from winning larger states like New York, Massachusetts, and North Carolina, Carter still would have probably lost anyway. But the worst person on the Kennedy campaign might have been Paul Corbin. See, before the only debate between Reagan and Carter, the Reagan campaign received Carter's debate playbook, which outlined Carter's entire debate strategy. This became known as Debategate. It was so serious that there was even a federal investigation as to who stole the playbook. Craig Shirley, a Reagan biographer, said that Paul Corbin, who was an aide to the Kennedy campaign, gave the playbook to Reagan's campaign. This is why I say that the worst person might have been Corbin, because we really don't know if this was him or not, as Shirley doesn't really give any citations whatsoever as to his sources and to the claim. And with that, we are now done with the video. Thank you all very much. If you liked this video, please hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can check out these playlists if you want to watch more videos about American and international elections. See you in the next video. Bye for now.